This is going to be a bit of a history lesson and a focus on two very dedicated prophets from the Old Testament times, Elijah and Elisha. A couple months ago, I gave a lesson on Titus and realized how much I enjoyed looking into more the personalities and the happenings of individual people mentioned in the Bible. And I also realized I had trouble remembering what Elijah did versus what Elisha did. And so if some of you are very comfortable with all this, then this is going to be a review, but hopefully you'll enjoy it. The Hebrew word for prophet is nebi, N-E-B-I, and it means, delightfully, to bubble forth and to speak for another. And obviously the prophets of old took the messages from God to the people. The timing of the prophets in the Bible went from when the Israelites entered the land of Canaan to when Judah was captured by Babylon. And an interesting little side note, I didn't know this, maybe you did. The minor prophets and the major prophets in the Bible, they're not identified by those names because of importance. They're identified by those names because of length of their books. The minor prophets are the short ones, and the major prophets are the long ones. Also, obviously, when the Jews came into the land, Canaanites and Philistines lived originally in the land that the Jews moved into. And those people, the Canaanites and the Philistines, worship Baal. Now I'm going to show you, since I don't do PowerPoint, I'm going to show you a picture here, and hopefully you can follow this little history lesson that I've got on here. If I can get this lined up right. Make sure they're up higher. How's that? Okay. So you can see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, also known as Israel. And then you can see Jacob's two wives, Leah and Rachel, and not direct descendants from there, but on Rachel's side, you know that she was the mother of Joseph and Benjamin. Saul, the first king of the Jews, was a Benjamite. And under Joseph's son Ephraim, we'll get down to Jeroboam in a moment. Go over to Leah, and you have her son Judah, down from him David and Solomon, and then Rehoboam. And if you remember, when Rehoboam became king, he consulted with his advisors about whether or not to ease off on the taxes of the people. And his advisors said, yes, please ease off. His peers said, no, get stronger, show your strength. And so that's what he did. And that caused the split of the tribes into the two kingdoms. So under Rehoboam, he became king of Judah in the south. And there were two tribes that made up that kingdom, Judah and Benjamin. Capital of Judah was Jerusalem. And many years later, it was captured by Babylon. And when they were removed from their area by the Babylonians, they were able to maintain their identity and later would deny the Samaritan Jews. Now, to get to the Samaritan Jews, you have to go over to Israel, the kingdom of Israel, which was the north. It was 10 tribes. Its capital was Samaria. And when they were captured by the Assyrians, there was a lot of intermarriage, but many of them, even with the intermarriage, considered themselves Jewish. So there were Samaritan Jews, but the Samaritan Jews under Israel, but the Judah Jews under the country of Judah did not accept the Samaritan Jews. So that was where a lot of controversy came. And I also made this map to show you how the division was. You have the Mediterranean Sea here. I'm sorry, get this straight. Judah in the south with the capital of Jerusalem, Israel in the north with the capital of Samaria. And note that Syria, I can't do this backwards, I'm sorry, that Syria is up here. And the Jordan River is here between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. That makes a little difference in some of the things I'm going to mention here. So now we get to Elijah and Elisha. They were prophets in the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. Their stories are in 1 Kings 17 to 21 and 2 Kings 1, 2, 6, 8, 9, a couple different chapters in there. So to focus on Elijah first, Elijah means Yahweh is my God. And in history, as you read about Elijah, he was ranked with Moses as a guide for the Jews against Baal worship. He was that important in his efforts to lead the Jews to staying with one God and not being involved with the Baal worship of the Canaanites and the Philistines. Elijah was known for having very long hair and a girdle of skin and was very robust and an outdoorsman. And when you read about his stories, it frequently says the word of the Lord came to Elijah, or the angel of the Lord said to Elijah. So several different things that Elijah did that related to his prophecies, He prophesied that there would be a drought for 3 years. This was during the time that Ahab was king of the northern Israel kingdom. And of course, Ahab married Jezebel. And she was not of Jewish origin, and that led to many, many problems. With the prophecy of the drought, Jezebel was extremely upset with Elijah, and he had to hide. And so he was told by God to go to a stream and stay there. He could drink the water there, and he was fed by ravens. When the stream dried up because of the drought, God said, go find a widow in Zarephath. And the widow that Elijah found said she was going to die because of the drought, and her son was also going to die because she had enough flour and oil for one more meal, and that was going to be it. But Elijah said, with God's guidance, that will not happen. And the widow's jar of flour and jug full of oil was kept full for the whole 3 years of the drought. One of the miracles that Elijah is credited with was when this widow's son died, Elijah prayed and the son was returned to life. God told Elijah at that time to go meet with Ahab. And when Ahab saw Elijah, he said, you troublemaker of Israel. And Elijah said, no, not me. You're the troublemaker of Israel. I would have loved to know the personalities of some of these people. Anyway, this was the story of when Elijah met the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, another pagan god, at Mount Carmel, and challenged them to identify who was really God. And obviously, a bull was given to both of these teams, so to speak. And Elijah said, you guys start first. And so they cut up the bull and prayed to their god Baal for hours and hours and hours and hours to put fire to the bull. And again, to notice Elijah's personality here, he teased him and ridiculed him after a while when there was no fire. He said, shout louder. Maybe your God is thinking. Maybe he's relieving himself. Maybe he's traveling. Maybe he's sleeping. But there was, of course, no answer. And so when it was Elijah's turn to show that God was the real and only God, he called for 12 different jugs of water to be poured on the sacrifice to show even more the power of God. And obviously in 1 Kings 18 is one of the greatest declarations of faith I've ever heard. 1 Kings 18, 36 and 37. When it was time to offer the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and said, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, make known today that you are God in Israel, that I'm your servant and have done all these things by your instructions. Answer me, Lord, answer me. Then these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are winning back their hearts. So a fire from the Lord fell down and consumed the burnt offering, wood, stones, and dirt, even dried up the water that was in the trench. So at that time, of course, the Jews who had all congregated declared, yes, we will follow God because he is the God. Can you imagine one person going up against 850 other people who were bound and determined to prove him wrong? But he had the strength in God that he would prove that God was real. Another interesting fact at the end of this situation, before the rains came to end the drought, Ahab was going to go back to his city of Jezreel, and Elijah joyfully ran ahead of him all the way to Jezreel. Again, that has to be quite a feat with knowing that Ahab was probably in a chariot of some sort. Later, Elijah did bemoan to God that he was the last and only prophet and was fearful for his life because, again, Jezebel wanted him dead. God reassured him there were still 7,000 who had not bowed to Baal. And God also told him that Elisha would take his place. Now we know that Elijah found Elisha plowing. He put his cloak on him, signifying that he was going to pass on his role of prophet. Now Ahab at that time had wanted a vineyard owned by Naboth, and Naboth had rightfully refused to give his family the property, or give his family's property to Ahab. And so Jezebel wanted to please her husband Ahab, and so she had Naboth killed. And as a result of that shenanigan, Elijah prophesied both the death of Ahab and of Jezebel. Ahab actually repented at that time, and Elijah did delay the punishment until after Ahab would die. There was another story about the king of the north of Israel, King Ahaziah, who was injured and sent messengers to get information from Beelzebub, who was a god of Ekron, which is a Philistine city. So again, we're talking in the territory where the Philistines lived. Elisha met the messengers while they were on the way to Ekron and sent them back to King Ahaziah, saying that you are going to die. The king sent 50 soldiers to get Elijah and bring him to the king. Elisha had those 50 killed with fire. King sent another 50. Same thing happened. When the third 50 were sent, these are soldiers. The leader pleaded for their lives, and so Elisha went with them to King Ahaziah and told him that he would die for ignoring God and seeking a false god. When Elisha was near death and was wanting to go across the Jordan, Elisha was with him, and would not leave him. And at that time, Elijah struck the river Jordan with his rolled up cloak, and the waters parted. And I'm going to ask you a question at the end of this as to how many times waters were parted in the Bible. Another question I'll ask you at the end is what happened with Elijah? Because when Elisha asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit, Elisha said he would receive that if Elisha, saw Elijah taken away. And we know that Elijah was taken away in a fiery chariot. He had ministered to the northern tribe for 15 years. Now, Elisha was a bit of a different man. He had a house in Samaria. He was very well groomed and well mannered. He was more of a teacher and a preacher than Elijah was. He was also an advisor to several different kings of Israel. He was also bald, and we'll get a bit to that in a minute. Some of the miracles that Elisha did, he purified the water of Jericho so that it could be used for drinking and for watering plants and feeding the animals. But the question I have about him being bald, there were boys who mocked him and teased him about it. And he cursed them, and 2 bears came out and mauled them. So I'll get back to that later. You may know from the history of the slaves and slavery that was predominant in that time that children could be sold into slavery if their father died in debt. The persons to whom he owed money could take his children as slaves. So there was a widow who asked Elijah's help to keep her sons from slavery. And she said she only had 1 jar of olive oil. Of course, olive oil was valuable at that time. Elisha told her to collect as many jars as she could from her household and neighbors and fill them with oil. And she was able, from her 1 jar of olive oil, to fill all these other jars. And she then could sell that olive oil, and that paid off her husband's family debt. And so her children were not sold into slavery. Also, in Elisha's travels, he met a Shunammite woman, and she probably was a bit of a wealthier lady. She made a room for Elisha on her roof. So every time he traveled through the territory, he could stay with her. He asked how he might help her for her generosity to him. And she said, I'm fine. But he was told by his servant that she did not have a son. She did not have a child. And so he prophesied that she would have a child. And a year later, she did. But then several years later, that child died. And Elisha, with prayers to God, brought that child back to life. So another thing I'm going to mention at the end is how many resurrections were there in the Bible? So stick that in the back of your thought. Another miracle that he did, a servant had unknowingly gathered some poisonous plants to make what we would probably call a vegetable soup for food for Elisha and his disciples. And Elisha made that soup non-poisonous. He changed it. He also was able to feed 100 people with just 20 loaves of bread. And we think of Jesus multiplying the loaves of bread to feed the 5,000. We probably all know the story of Naaman, who had a skin disease, probably leprosy. His wife had a Jewish girl slave or servant who told her about Elisha, and Naaman got permission to leave where he was a soldier to go to the northern kingdom of Israel. And he brought gifts to the king and asked the king to cure him. And the king said, I can't cure you. I don't, that's not something I can do. But when Elisha heard about this, he said that Naaman should come to him. So Naaman did, but Elisha simply sent a verbal message to Naaman saying, go wash in the Jordan 7 times and you will be cured. Naaman was very upset about this. He thought the prophet would come and talk to him directly because he was a great man, great soldier. And his servants, Naaman's servants, said, if he'd asked you to do something really tremendous, you would have done it. Why not go and try the 7 washings in Jordan? And he did. And he then was cured of his leprosy. He offered Elisha all the gifts that he had brought from the king, but Elisha refused. So he said, could he take soil from Israel back to his land so that he could spread it on the ground so that he could worship on Israeli soil and worship God in that manner? Another miracle that's credited to Elijah is when the disciples had borrowed an axe to chop down trees to build a dwelling for them, for Elisha and all of them. One of the disciples lost a borrowed axe in a river. And of course it would sink, it was heavy. And Elisha made it float so they could have it back, retrieve it, use it, and return it to the original owner. Also, Also, Elisha helped the king of Israel be prepared for the attacks of the king of Aram. And Aram sent soldiers to capture Elijah because he was so upset with him. And Elisha asked God, again, this is all interaction between Elijah and Elisha and God on a very regular basis. Elisha asked God to blind these soldiers, and then he led them out into the Samaritan wilderness, which was a good ways away from Israel. It was the wilderness would have been up in this area up here. When their sight was restored, the Israeli king asked if he should kill them. And Elisha said, no, feed them, release them, and let them go back to their own Aram. And they then left Israel alone after that. So Elisha died and was buried, but there was one more miracle related to him later after he had died. There were Moabites who were invading, and some people who were in a funeral procession for a man hid this dead man's body in Elisha's tomb. And when the dead man's body touched Elisha's bones, the man became alive again and stood up. So again, we have a resurrection. By history, Elisha ministered for 50 years in the northern kingdom of Israel. So we have Elijah and his miracles. We have Elisha and his miracles, all related to how they spoke with God. God spoke with them. The angels spoke with them. And so now I have a couple of questions. How many resurrections were there in the Bible? Not counting Jesus. We know he was resurrected to immortality. These others were resurrected to mortal life. And how many times were waters parted so people could cross over in dry land?